Hey everybody, it's Ben here. Today we've got a video that's very different from what I usually do and very personal. What we're going to be talking about is spreading cremation ashes, but doing it a little bit differently. In this case, it's going to be by firing them out of a shotgun. So first of all, this video is not going to be about exactly how you load a shotgun shell with gunpowder and cremated ashes. We covered that in a different video. Please take a look in the video description so you can go straight to that video if that's what you want to watch. This video is going to be more about why you would want to fire a loved one out of a shotgun and how you would go about it, where you would do it, what gun you would use, who would be involved in the event. One of the first things, typically when it comes to spreading cremated ashes, is where are you going to do that? So let's start off with the land, the property, or the location where you'll be doing this. Probably one of the first things you'll want to think about is if this is going to be done on private property or public property. Private property, frankly, will make it a lot easier if this is on family land or if it's on maybe a hunting friend's private property. All you really need is just the permission of the property owner. It makes it very easy to have a nice private event. Nobody's going to bother you. You don't have to get any kind of permits or any sort of strange special permission. Now, in our case, my father did say that when he went, he wanted to be cremated and have his ashes spread out at some hunting land that belonged to a friend of his. It was up on a hill, beautiful view surrounded by woods and a lake, and that's a place that he went hunting very often. Deer, pheasants, ducks, just a beautiful place for it. Now, alternatively, you might want to have the ashes spread on public property. The big thing that you want to keep in mind is that if you're using a firearm on public property, what you have to do because of that. For example, where I live, there's a number of state parks where hunting is allowed, but only during the hunting season. So if during deer hunting season, people were hearing gunshots, that would be completely expected, but if you were hearing gunshots in the spring, people might be calling the cops. So you definitely want to know what's allowed on the piece of public property that you're on, in case there's any kind of a permit that would be required, or if it can only be done, for example, at a certain time of year. Now, one thing that's nice with cremation is that the ashes don't have to be spread right away. For instance, in our family, my father passed away 3 months before we actually held the funeral and spread the ashes. So if you wanted to be able to wait until, say, duck season to spread the ashes, that's one thing that's actually kind of nice with cremation, is that it can give you a little bit more time to figure out exactly what it is that you want to do. For example, in the case of my family, I had a brother who was literally in a different hemisphere. And because my father was cremated and we planned out a couple of months in advance, it allowed for him to be able to come back home to attend the ceremony. Another thing you're probably going to want to think about right away is what type of shells you're planning to use. Now, for starters, part of it does tie into what firearm you wish to use. For example, if you're loading up a shotgun, what gauge is it? Is it a 12 gauge? Is it a 10 gauge, 20? Certainly that makes a difference. What we decided to do was to use brass shotgun shells. A couple of reasons for that. One is that my father was, he was really into kind of some of the old-timey hunting. He did a lot of muzzle loading. He had a flintlock. He actually built an old-fashioned Kentucky rifle from scratch. He also had a lot of the muzzle loading and reloading supplies around. So I was able to use his powder, some of his tools to load up these brass shells. I really liked kind of the old-timiness of it, and by loading these shells up myself, it's kind of like it allowed me to spend a little bit more time with him doing some of the sorts of things that he loved. Another thing that's nice about a brass shotgun shell, as opposed to a plastic one, is it certainly looks nice as part of a presentation. If you have your loved one's remains loaded up into shotgun shells. These would certainly look very nice as part of a display. Another part of it too is that it makes a very nice keepsake. So if you have family members firing off the ashes, they can actually keep the brass shotgun shell as a token of the memory of the event. Another nice thing with the brass shotgun shells is they can be reused many times. So let's say it's just you going out into a duck boat spreading the ashes. You could actually just save the brass shotgun shells and reuse them many, many times. So every time you go out hunting after that, you'd still have that memory. One other thing here was at the ash spreading ceremony, we had a table set up with some items on there, including a framed photo to remind us of my father. This here was an old wood box that was in with his reloading supplies. Now, he had a lot of just old tins and boxes and things. This one happened to be from a shaving set, believe it or not. But by chance, it was exactly the right size to hold 8 of these brass 20-gauge shotgun shells. So it made a really nice display to have there at the funeral. You'll also want to think about which firearm that you'll use for spreading the ashes. Now, in our case, right back here behind me, I've got a 20-gauge break action shotgun. My dad always shot with 20 gauges. This gun has some sentimental value. This actually belonged to my grandmother. I looked at the serial number on this and figured out the year of manufacture, which was 1926. So as of right now, this is a 94-year-old gun. I hope I look this good when I'm 94 years old. Break action is nice and safe because you cannot fire it when it is open like this. And it's very easy to operate. Another thing is if you're using anything that I would call an experimental round, which having a shotgun shell full of human cremated remains, I would say qualifies. You want to make sure that the gun is going to operate properly. Some guns, such as a semi-automatic, they actually reload by using some of the escaping gas to power it. I don't know that one of these rounds would properly operate a semi-auto shotgun. Likewise, with a pump-action shotgun, additional rounds would be stored up in the stock and cycled through as you use the pump action. What I would strongly suggest is that if you're using something other than a simple break action style shotgun, that you test it ahead of time to make sure that the rounds that you make will properly feed through the firearm. If it's a semi-auto, that it will properly cycle. Now, of course, you don't want to be doing that ahead of time with the rounds that you did up with ashes. What I did is I actually made up some dummy rounds with fireplace ash. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same as with the cremated remains, but it's close enough to at least let you know that everything's working properly. So I did make up a couple of these fireplace ash dummy rounds. I took them out to the firing range. I tested them. I even videotaped so I could watch playback, make sure everything was working right. I did use Pyrodex here, basically artificial black powder, for these rounds, and I found it made a nice pop sound. We had a nice amount of smoke with it. And I also did test that out with this particular firearm to make sure everything was working as it should have. Now, I'm not really that much of a gun guy. I just kind of know the basics. So I did go over this gun. I also took it over to a hunting buddy of my father's, who's a gunsmith, and had him take a look at it to make sure that everything was working well and that it would be safe to fire. Now, something else sentimental about this particular gun was the one time that I went out hunting with my dad. I had gone target shooting with him a number of times, shooting clay pigeons and sporting clays, things like that. But I had only ever actually gone hunting with a gun instead of a camera just one time. We went out pheasant hunting. It was very nice to get to spend the time with him and the dog. And when the dog flushed out a pheasant, I swung the gun, pulled the trigger, and I nailed it. And that's the first and last time I ever went hunting. I'm kind of an animal lover. Usually I'm feeding the animals or taking photos of them. But the one time that I went out actually hunting, it was with this gun, and I did share that story with my family when we spread his ashes. So now on to the actual ceremony, actually firing off ashes from a shotgun. What we did was we were out at this private hunting land, and it was almost like a second funeral. The public funeral, there were a lot of people there. It was very busy. We were still dealing with coronavirus. So for spreading the ashes out on the private land, we brought two pop-up tents because this was going to be a rain or shine event. Now, fortunately, right as we started, the sun came out, which was very nice. And in that case, just having the shade from the tents was good. We were originally planning on bringing a few chairs, just because some of the older folks that might need to sit down. And in the end, the entire thing took a lot longer than I expected. So I was glad we had plenty of chairs there. We had a lot of family members telling stories, that sort of thing, which was nice, but frankly, it even would have been hard on my feet. So following ceremony, telling stories, all that sort of thing, at the very end, I made an announcement that we we're going to be firing ashes from a shotgun. Now, ahead of time, I had already spoken with my brothers, my uncles, letting them know that this is something that I wanted to do and see who would want to participate, including finding out how many rounds that I would need to have available for firing off. Another reason for doing it at the end is just to be sensitive of others. You do have to keep in mind that some people have associations with shotguns of traditions, hunting, going out and, shooting some clay pigeons, that sort of thing. But for other people have different associations with guns, perhaps that of violence, or, you might even have somebody there with PTSD. By having this at the end, it gave an opportunity for anybody like that to be able to step away. So what I did is I invited my brothers and uncles and anybody else who wanted to come forward. So we just stepped downwind and downhill a little bit. Another thing is you don't want to accidentally exclude anybody. When I made this announcement, I was turning to just move downhill a little bit. Somebody said, what about girls? And I said, well, yeah, any women who want to participate, certainly welcome as well. I didn't in any way intend to exclude half of everybody there. But yeah, a lot of times with hunting, we tend to think of that as sort of a male thing. You also don't want to accidentally exclude somebody, perhaps older or younger. Heck, you might have grandma there, and you know what? Maybe she wants to take a turn, even if that means, having a couple of strong guys roll her downhill in the wheelchair a little bit. And actually, another thing that was really special to me is while we were doing this, my 9-year-old daughter came up to me and said that she wanted to take a turn shooting as well. I hadn't even thought about that at all. She's younger. She'd never fired a real gun before like that. So it was special, and I was proud of her for coming forward like that as well. Now, since we were forward, that put our backs to the crowd. I've got a lot of uncles who, they've gone hunting forever, but I also had a few people who had never fired a gun before, or maybe, for example, hadn't operated a break-action shotgun, which is simple to operate, but you know what? If you've never done it, what do you do? So with our backs to the crowd, I was able to very simply show a person how to slide the lever over, break it open, load around, close it, and which trigger to use. So that saved any sort of awkwardness or even embarrassment. Then after firing, each person was able to keep the brass round as a memento of the event. Now, another thing that I had done was where we were outside, there were actually a couple of obstacles that I wanted people to avoid, and I marked those with a blaze orange ribbon, which is the traditional color of safety for gun hunting. But I also used them as kind of ribbons and banners coming off of the tent, and I even put a piece down on a stake downhill a little bit. And one of the reasons for doing that was essentially as a windsock. By taking a look at the ribbons, you could see which direction the wind was blowing. That was important for two reasons. One was, if you're firing ash into the air, you don't want to be firing upwind. The whole point is to spread out the ashes. We don't want any coming back at us. Another reason is that sound travels differently upwind versus downwind. By firing with the wind away from the crowd, gunshots are actually quite a bit quieter. The day before, we did have military honors at the public funeral, including a 21-gun salute. And frankly, it was pretty loud, and I think a lot of folks in the crowd were startled by that initial shot because it was up on an angle, but relatively towards the crowd. Very loud and, you know, a little unsettling. Now, firing off these black powder rounds downwind with a load of only ash instead of shot, it made a nice pop, made a nice little bit of smoke, but it wasn't loud. It was a nice way to remember somebody. Now, because I talked with some of my relatives ahead of time, the ones that I was pretty confident wanted to participate in this, I had a sense of how many rounds I was going to need. Now, I had originally made up 8 rounds, and a big part of that was because that fit really nicely in this box here. It made for a very nice display. It made for an easy way to carry the ashes out to where we were firing them off. I still had some additional ash when I was done loading those original 8 shells. I had 2 more brass shells available to me at the time, so I loaded those up for a total of 10. And then I wanted to make sure I had at least a few more. I had a little bit more ash, so I just loaded up plastic shotgun shells, and I had a total of 16 by the time I was done. Originally, I expected about a dozen people to participate. I had probably 2, maybe 3 more people participate that I hadn't expected, but I had the additional rounds available. And then at the very end, there were 2 shells left. I checked to see if anybody else wanted to participate, and when everybody had fired off a round who wanted to, those last 2, I loaded up, and I was able to give my dad both barrels. So lastly, I want to share with you what I liked about doing this, and maybe a thing or two that I would change had I had this to do all over again. Overall, one of the first things that felt special to me here was just the fact that I hand-loaded these shells myself. It really felt like I got to spend a little bit more time with my dad, using some of his tools, actually handling the cremated ash itself, which, I mean, it might sound a little weird, but there was definitely something special about that. I liked that I got good support from my family. When I was first going to tell some of my family members what I had planned to do, I wasn't sure that everybody would get it. I mean, certainly a hunting buddy would, a couple of my uncles would, but, you know, what would my mom think of this? You know, what would some of my brothers think of this? And fortunately, when I told them, everybody thought it was a good idea. Everybody understood why I wanted to do this, and that family support really meant a lot. I also really liked that with the black powder, you get a nice smoke going out from the blast. If you were using modern smokeless powder and you fire a gun, you really don't see anything. There's just a bang and it's gone. With the ash and the black powder together, there was really a nice poof of smoke coming out. It felt more like we were doing something by being able to actually see that. I'm also glad that we used the brass shells. It felt more ceremonial that way. I liked having a keepsake that everybody would be able to have and remember the event. Lastly, it was the location. This really was the location where my father said that he wanted his ashes spread. He was a hunter, deer, waterfowl, pheasants, and we were right there where he wanted his ashes to be spread. And I think we did it in a way that would have made him smile. So what would I have done different? Frankly, very little. I think it all worked out very nicely. Two things that I could think of is possibly adding music. Music is a very traditional part of any ceremonial event. Now, we did already earlier have music. We had a PA so that we could all hear each other telling stories, with a microphone for voice amplification, and we had some music playing with that. We also had a bagpiper there, and it's kind of neat with something like live music like that. You could do that anywhere. You could be in the middle of nowhere and having bagpipes play. But if you need to use any kind of electrical equipment, like that PA, for example, keep in mind that you'll need to have it set up so that you can run it on battery power. Chances are, where you're out there shooting a gun, you're not going to have an electric outlet and an extension cord. This is actually a nice little inverter that runs off of cordless drill batteries that I already had. This ran a PA for 2 hours, no problem, taking less than a quarter of this battery. The other thing that I possibly would have changed was just perhaps a small table. Standing out in the middle of a field, my hands got a little bit full at some points. I'm handling a shotgun. I've also got all of the shells and, kind of trying to do a few different things at once. Have the shells, load the shotgun, show somebody else how to use it. Maybe a small table would have been nice. In this case, I did have other people there, so I was able to have somebody holding the shells right next to me. But depending on what you're doing, just a little table. Certainly, you don't want to be setting things on the ground, picking them up, everything like that. So maybe just keeping in mind where you want to have everything. I hope that this gives you some ideas in how you would want to be able to spread the ashes of a loved one. Maybe you want to do something a little bit more public than what we did. Maybe something a little more private. Maybe it's just you and the dog in a duck boat somewhere. However you want to do it, just make sure that it's something special, appropriate, and memorable for you when you send off your loved one with a bang.